October 7th, 2025. Detective Sergeant Richard Brinkley stood before the assembled press in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, his weathered face bearing the weight of a case that had consumed nearly 5 decades. Behind him, projected on a screen, was a grainy 1978 photograph of a recreation area, a boat ramp, and the words that had haunted investigators for 47 years. Unidentified male, Rutherford County John Doe. Today, Brinkley began, his voice steady but emotional. I can finally give this man his name back. The victim found at Poole Knobs Recreation Area on August 1st, 1978. A man shot 4 times, wrapped in a blanket, and burned in an attempt to erase his very existence, has been identified as Jessie Lee Williamson. He was 52 years old. He was from Cullman, Alabama. And for 47 years, his family never knew what happened to him. The room erupted with questions. How was he identified? Who killed him? Why was he murdered? But the most haunting question of all remained unanswered. After nearly half a century, after identifying the victim using cutting-edge DNA technology that didn't exist when the crime occurred, why hasn't anyone been charged with his murder? This is the story of a man who became a number, case UP85 in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. A man reduced to forensic details. White male, 5'10", 100 pounds, partial dentures, surgical scars, quarter-sized mole. A man whose brutal murder in rural Tennessee launched an investigation that would span 5 decades, involve groundbreaking DNA science, and ultimately give closure to a family that never stopped wondering where their loved one had gone. But this is also the story of a killer still walking free. Someone who pulled the trigger 4 times in 1978, shot Jessie Lee Williamson twice in the face, wrapped his body in a blanket, dragged him to a boat ramp, and set him on fire. Someone who has lived 47 years believing they got away with murder. Someone who, as you're reading this right now, might still be out there. Before we dive into this haunting case, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This investigation took years to partially solve. Involves advanced forensic genetic genealogy that's rewriting how we approach cold cases, and ends with a plea. If you know what happened to Jessie Lee Williamson, it's not too late to come forward. Where are you watching from today? Whether you're in Tennessee, where this tragedy unfolded, Alabama, where Jessie grew up, or anywhere else in the world, this case reminds us that every unidentified person is someone's family member. Drop a comment with your location. Let's build a community dedicated to bringing closure to families and justice to victims. And if you're watching late at night like I was when researching this case, what time is it where you are? These cold cases hit differently in the quiet hours, don't they? Now, let's go back to August 1st, 1978. A hot summer morning in Tennessee, when a maintenance worker made a discovery that would haunt law enforcement for nearly half a century. August 1st, 1978. LaVergne, Tennessee. The sun had barely crested over the rolling hills of Rutherford County when a maintenance worker arrived at Poole Knobs Recreation Area to begin his morning rounds. The recreation area, situated along Jones Road, was a popular spot for locals, a place where families came to fish, launch boats, and enjoy Tennessee's natural beauty. The boat ramp in particular saw heavy use during the summer months, with fishermen arriving at dawn to catch bass and crappie in the nearby waters. But on this particular morning, something was wrong. As the maintenance worker approached the boat ramp, he noticed scorch marks on the concrete. Closer inspection revealed what appeared to be the remnants of a fire, not the controlled burn of a campfire, but something more disturbing. And then he saw it. Human remains, partially burned, wrapped in what appeared to be a blanket. The maintenance worker immediately contacted the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office. Within 30 minutes, deputies arrived at the scene, securing the area and calling for additional resources. What they discovered would become one of the most baffling and enduring cold cases in Tennessee history. The victim was a white male, his body showing clear signs of violence. An autopsy conducted by the medical examiner revealed the brutal nature of the crime. The man had been shot 4 times. 2 bullets had entered his face at close range, execution-style wounds that suggested the killer wanted to ensure the victim was dead. The other 2 gunshot wounds were to the body. Based on blood evidence and the positioning of the body, investigators determined that the victim had been shot elsewhere, then transported to the boat ramp. Someone had wrapped his body in a blanket, dragged him to this remote location, and attempted to burn the evidence of their crime. The fire, while damaging, had not completely destroyed the body. One hand remained relatively intact, allowing investigators to collect fingerprints. The victim's teeth, though damaged, could potentially be used for dental identification. And scattered around the scene were fragments of evidence that investigators meticulously cataloged: fibers from the blanket, shell casings from the bullets, tire tracks in the soft dirt near the boat ramp. But there was one crucial problem. Nobody knew who this man was. The Rutherford County Sheriff's Office immediately began the process of trying to identify the victim. They ran the fingerprints through every available database, local, state, and federal. No matches. They contacted dental records offices across Tennessee and neighboring states, hoping that the partial dentures might provide a lead. Nothing. They issued bulletins to law enforcement agencies throughout the Southeast, describing the victim and asking if anyone had filed a missing persons report that matched his description. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And still, the man found at Poole Knobs Recreation Area remained unidentified. What investigators were able to determine painted a portrait of an individual who had lived a full life before his brutal death. The victim was estimated to be between 30 and 40 years old. Later forensic analysis would adjust this to approximately 52 years old. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed approximately 160 pounds, suggesting a lean build. His medium-length brown hair had begun to gray, consistent with middle age. Most significantly, he bore several distinctive features that investigators hoped might help identify him. A partial set of dentures in his upper jaw, surgical scars on his chest, consistent with open-heart surgery or a similar major medical procedure, and a distinctive quarter-sized mole on his torso, about 2 inches from his waistline. These details were significant. In 1978, heart surgery was not as common as it is today. Someone who had undergone such a procedure would likely have extensive medical records, hospital stays, and follow-up appointments. Someone with distinctive dental work would have a dentist who knew them. Someone with a unique mole might be recognized by family or friends, and yet no one came forward. The initial investigation was thorough and methodical. Detective teams canvassed the LaVergne area, interviewing residents who lived near Poole Knobs Recreation Area. Had anyone seen suspicious activity on the night of July 31st or early morning of August 1st? Had anyone heard gunshots? Had anyone noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked near the boat ramp? A few potential leads emerged. One witness reported hearing what might have been gunshots sometime after midnight, though they couldn't pinpoint the exact time, and had assumed it was hunters or kids setting off fireworks. Another witness remembered seeing a vehicle, possibly a dark-colored sedan, parked near the recreation area around 2:00 a.m., which struck them as unusual given the late hour. But neither of these leads produced concrete evidence or suspects. Investigators also explored the possibility that the murder had occurred elsewhere, and the body had simply been dumped at Poole Knobs. The lack of significant blood at the scene supported this theory. Someone had killed this man at another location, wrapped him in a blanket, transported him to the boat ramp, and attempted to destroy evidence by setting him on fire. This suggested planning, deliberation, and a vehicle capable of transporting a body. But why Poole Knobs? Was the killer familiar with the area? Did they live nearby? Or was this simply a location chosen for its relative isolation and accessibility? By the fall of 1978, the investigation had hit multiple dead ends. The victim remained unidentified. No missing persons reports matched his description. No family members came forward looking for a loved one. It was as if this man had simply appeared at the boat ramp, with no past, no identity, no one searching for him. The medical examiner's office prepared a detailed report documenting every aspect of the victim's physical characteristics, hoping that future technological advances might help identify him. His fingerprints were carefully preserved. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, and his remains were eventually buried in a local cemetery, with a simple marker noting only that this was an unidentified male found in Rutherford County in 1960. He became known simply as Rutherford County John Doe, or, in official records, as UP-85, an entry in what would eventually become the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NAMUS. He was a case number, a file in a cabinet, a mystery that haunted the investigators who had stood over his burned body and promised to give him his name back. What time is it where you're watching? Are you staying up late following this case, just like Detective Brinkley did for years? Hit that like button if you believe every unidentified person deserves their name back, and drop a comment. Have you ever heard of a case where someone went missing and was never reported? It happens more often than you think, and it's one reason cases like Jessie Lee Williamson's remain unsolved for decades. The late 1970s were a different era in forensic science. DNA analysis didn't exist as an investigative tool. James Watson and Francis Crick had discovered the structure of DNA in 1953, but using it to identify criminals or victims wouldn't become reality until the mid-1980s. Computer databases were primitive. National information sharing networks like NAMUS wouldn't be established until 2007. When the unidentified man was found at Poole Knobs in 1978, investigators had to rely on fingerprints, dental records, and witness statements, the same tools that had been used for decades. As the case grew cold, it didn't grow forgotten. Every few years, a new detective would be assigned to review the file. They would look at the photographs, read the witness statements, study the autopsy report. They would reach out to medical examiners in surrounding states, asking if anyone had inquired about a middle-aged man with heart surgery scars who had gone missing in 1992. They would contact veterans' hospitals, thinking perhaps the surgical scars were related to military service. They would check Social Security death records, searching for men who had stopped filing in 1978 without explanation. Each review yielded nothing. In the 1990s, as DNA technology became more sophisticated, the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office took a crucial step. They had DNA extracted from the victim's remains and created a profile. This profile was uploaded to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, which allows law enforcement agencies to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes and missing persons cases across the country. No matches. The DNA profile confirmed that the victim's genetic information was preserved and available, but it didn't tell investigators who he was. CODIS only works if there's something to match against: a sample from a missing persons case, DNA from a family member who has submitted a reference sample, or a profile from a previous criminal investigation. Without any of those connections, the John Doe's DNA profile sat in the database, waiting for a match that never came. In 2018, investigators tried a different approach: facial reconstruction. Using the victim's skull, forensic artists created both a physical bust and a digital rendering of what the man might have looked like in life. The images were released to media outlets throughout Tennessee, Alabama, and neighboring states. News stories ran with headlines like, "Can you help identify this man?" and "47-year-old cold case needs your help." Tips came in. A woman in Alabama thought the reconstruction looked like her uncle, who had gone missing in the 1970s, but DNA testing ruled out the connection. A man in Georgia was certain the victim was a friend from his Army days, but military records showed that friend had died in a documented car accident in 1982. Each lead was investigated, and each lead ended in disappointment. The frustration was palpable. The Rutherford County Sheriff's Office had photographs of the victim. They had his fingerprints. They had his DNA. They had detailed medical information about his heart surgery and dental work. They had a distinctive mole that should have been recognizable to anyone who knew him. And still, 40 years later, they had no idea who he was. Detective Sergeant Richard Brinkley inherited the case in 2015. Brinkley was a veteran investigator with decades of experience, but even he found himself stymied by the John Doe case. "It was one of the most frustrating investigations of my career," he would later reflect. "We had so much information, and yet it led nowhere. This man didn't just appear at that boat ramp. He had a life. He had a family. He came from somewhere, but where?" But Brinkley became obsessed with the case in the way that only dedicated cold case investigators can understand. He would pull the file late at night, spreading crime scene photographs across his desk, studying every detail. He contacted genealogy experts, asking if there was any way to use DNA to identify an unknown person. In 2018, most of them told him it wasn't possible, not without a reference sample from a family member. But then, in April 2018, something happened that would change cold case investigation forever. The arrest of the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, the man responsible for at least 13 murders and over 50 rapes in California during the 1970s and 1980s, was identified through a revolutionary technique called forensic genetic genealogy. Investigators had uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GED Match, a public genealogy database used by people researching their family trees. By finding distant relatives, third and fourth cousins, and building extensive family trees, genealogists were able to narrow down potential suspects until they identified DeAngelo. For cold case investigators around the country, this was a revelation. Cases that had seemed impossible to solve suddenly had a new avenue of investigation. All you needed was DNA, and you could potentially identify an unknown subject, whether that subject was a criminal or a victim. Detective Brinkley immediately began researching forensic genetic genealogy. He learned about companies like Othram Labs, Parabon Nano Labs, and Identifiers International that specialized in using this technique for law enforcement purposes. He learned about the challenges: degraded DNA, privacy concerns, the cost of analysis. But most importantly, he learned that it might be possible to finally give the Rutherford County John Doe his name back. In 2020, Brinkley made the decision to send evidence from the 1978 case to Othram Labs in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram specialized in cases exactly like this: degraded samples, burned remains, the traditional analysis had failed to process effectively. The challenge was significant. The victim's body had been burned, which damages DNA at the cellular level. The remains had been buried for decades, which can further degrade genetic material. And the DNA analysis technology of the 1990s, when the original profile was created, was far less sensitive than modern techniques. but Othram scientists believed they could extract usable DNA. Using a technique called forensic-grade genome sequencing, they would attempt to build a comprehensive genetic profile, not just the basic markers used in CODIS, but hundreds of thousands of genetic markers that could be compared to genealogy databases to find relatives. The process took months. Tissue samples were carefully processed in Othram's laboratory. DNA extraction protocols were optimized specifically for the degraded nature of the samples. Quality control checks were performed at every step, and slowly, painstakingly, a genetic profile began to emerge. By late 2020, Othram had successfully created a comprehensive DNA profile for the Rutherford County John Doe. This profile was then handed to Othram's in-house forensic genetic genealogy team, specialists who combined genetic data with traditional genealogy research to identify unknown individuals. The genetic genealogists uploaded the profile to genealogy databases, looking for matches. And this time, instead of silence, the databases returned results. Potential distant relatives, people who shared segments of DNA with the unknown victim. These weren't close relatives, not parents or siblings or even first cousins. These were third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a common ancestor several generations back. But it was enough. The genealogists began the painstaking process of building family trees. They started with the DNA matches and worked backward, identifying common ancestors. They then worked forward, documenting every descendant of those ancestors, creating sprawling family trees that encompassed hundreds of individuals across multiple generations. This work continued through 2020 and progress was slow. Genealogy research requires access to birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries, and family histories. Documents that aren't always easy to obtain, especially for families from the mid-20th century in rural Alabama. But the team persisted, and gradually, a picture began to emerge. The genealogists identified several branches of a family from Alabama, specifically from Cullman County. The DNA matches suggested that the John Doe was descended from families with surnames like Williamson, Lee, and related Alabama lineages. Detective Brinkley received regular updates from Othram. Each time, the family tree had grown larger, the potential pool of candidates had narrowed. By early 2024, the genealogists had identified several men from Cullman County, Alabama, who would have been approximately the right age in 1970, and who had potential connections to the DNA matches. One name kept appearing, Williamson. Brinkley began researching individuals with that surname who had lived in Cullman County in the 1970s. He looked for men born around 1926, who would have been approximately 50 in 1978. He searched for any records of someone going missing, dying unexpectedly, or simply disappearing from official records around 1978. And he found Jessie Lee Williamson. What's the weather like where you are today? Detective Brinkley spent countless nights like this one, researching family trees and missing persons reports, refusing to give up on a man he'd never met. Drop a comment. Have you ever researched your own family tree? The work these genealogists do is painstaking, going back generations to find a single connection. Jessie Lee Williamson was born in 1926 in Cullman County, Alabama, in the heart of the American South, during a time when the region was still recovering from the Great Depression. Cullman County, located in the north-central part of the state, was primarily agricultural, with families working small farms and supporting local businesses in the county seat of Cullman. Little detailed information about Jessie's early life has been made public, but what records exist paint a picture of a man who lived a quiet, working-class life. He grew up during World War II coming of age in the 1940s. When young men from rural Alabama were being drafted to fight overseas. Whether Jessie served in the military remains unclear from public records, though his later heart surgery scars suggested he may have had medical issues that could have affected his service eligibility. What is known is that by the 1970s, Jessie was living in Alabama and would have been in his early 50s, a time when many men were settling into retirement years or continuing work to support families. The surgical scars on his chest indicated he had undergone significant cardiac surgery at some point, likely in the years immediately preceding his death. In the 1970s, open-heart surgery was still a relatively new and risky procedure. The fact that Jessie had survived such surgery suggested he had access to quality medical care and had been dealing with serious health issues. The partial dentures found on his body told another story of middle age. Tooth loss and the need for dental prosthetics were common among men of his generation, particularly those from working-class backgrounds who may not have had access to preventative dental care in their youth. But here's what makes Jessie Lee Williamson's case so haunting. Despite living in Alabama, despite having medical records from heart surgery, despite having dental records from his prosthetics, despite presumably having family, friends, neighbors, and co-workers who knew him, when he disappeared sometime in mid to late 1978, no one reported him missing, or if they did, that report was never connected to the body found in Tennessee. This raises disturbing questions that Detective Brinkley is still trying to answer. Was Jessie estranged from his family? Had he been living a transient lifestyle, moving from place to place without maintaining stable relationships? Was his disappearance attributed to his health problems, with family assuming he had died of natural causes elsewhere? Or was something more sinister at play? Had someone intentionally ensured that Jessie's disappearance would go unreported? When Detective Brinkley identified Jessie Lee Williamson as a potential match for the Rutherford County John Doe, he began the process of locating living relatives who could provide reference DNA samples for comparison. This proved surprisingly difficult. Jessie had been dead for 47 years. Anyone who would have been his peer in 1978 would now be in their 90s or deceased. Children who were young in 1978 would now be in their 60s or 70s. Brinkley worked with the genealogists from Othram to trace Jessie's family tree. They identified potential descendants, nieces, nephews, grandnieces, grandnephews. But tracking down these individuals decades later proved challenging. People had moved. Names had changed through marriage. Some family lines had died out. Some families had no idea that a relative had disappeared in 1978. Finally, in 2024, Brinkley located a woman living in the Southeast who was identified as Jessie Lee Williamson's grandniece, the granddaughter of one of Jessie's siblings. She was, as far as investigators could determine, the only living close relative who could be located and who was willing to provide a DNA sample. The woman, whose name has not been released publicly to protect her privacy, was shocked to learn about Jessie Lee Williamson. She had vague memories from childhood of family members mentioning a relative named Jessie who had gone away or disappeared, but she had never known the full story. She had certainly never known that he might have been murdered in Tennessee and remained unidentified for nearly 5 decades. She agreed to provide a DNA sample. The comparison process took several weeks. The DNA from the grandniece was analyzed and compared to the comprehensive genetic profile of the Rutherford County John Doe. Scientists looked at shared genetic markers, calculated probability ratios, and confirmed familial relationships. The results came back in late September 12. It was a match. The man found at Poole Knobs Recreation Area on August 1st, the man who had been shot 4 times, wrapped in a blanket, and burned. the man who had spent 47 years as an unidentified victim, was definitively Jessie Lee Williamson of Cullman County, Alabama, for the first time since 1980. This man had his name back. October 7th, 2025. The press conference held by the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office was attended by local media, true crime reporters, and representatives from organizations dedicated to identifying missing and unidentified persons. Detective Sergeant Richard Brinkley stood at the podium, visibly emotional, as he made the announcement that would finally close one chapter of this case while opening another. For 47 years, this man has been known only as a John Doe, a case number, a set of remains without a name. Brinkley began. Today, thanks to advances in DNA technology and the tireless work of forensic genetic genealogists, we can finally tell you who he was. His name was Jessie Lee Williamson. He was 52 years old. He was from Cullman County, Alabama, and he was the victim of a brutal homicide that remains unsolved. The words remain no. Hung in the air. Brinkley explained the identification process, how forensic genetic genealogy had been used to build family trees, how a grandniece had provided reference DNA, how scientists at Othram Labs had worked with degraded samples to extract a genetic profile that could be compared to genealogy databases. He showed photographs from the 1978 crime scene, carefully edited to respect the dignity of the victim. He displayed maps showing the location of Poole Knobs Recreation Area and the distance from Cullman County, Alabama, approximately 90 miles. He presented the evidence that had been collected, the blanket fibers, the shell casings, the autopsy findings, and then he made a plea. "Someone out there knows what happened to Jessie Lee Williamson," Brinkley said, looking directly into the cameras. "Someone knows why he left Alabama in the summer of 1978. Someone knows who he was with. Someone knows who shot him 4 times, wrapped his body in a blanket, and tried to burn away the evidence of their crime. It has been for years. If you were involved in this crime, if you witnessed this crime, if you have any information about what happened to Jessie Lee Williamson, it is not too late to come forward. This man deserves justice. His family deserves answers." The Rutherford County Sheriff's Office set up a dedicated tip line for the case. Detective Brinkley's contact information was widely distributed. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System updated their records, changing Jessie Lee Williamson's status from unidentified to identified. But the killer's name remained unknown. The case generated immediate media attention. News outlets across Tennessee and Alabama ran stories about the identification. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to discussing the case. Online communities dedicated to solving cold cases began investigating, sharing theories, and analyzing the evidence. Several leads emerged in the days following the press conference. People who had lived in LaVergne in 1978 came forward with memories of unusual activity around the recreation area that summer. Former residents of Cullman County contacted investigators with information about Jessie Lee Williamson, where he had lived, where he had worked, who he had associated with. Family members came forward with photographs of Jessie, giving him a face to go with his name for the first time since 1978. But no one came forward with information about who killed him. Detective Brinkley and his team began the process of reinvestigating the case with new information. Now that they knew the victim's identity, they could research his life in Alabama. Who were his friends? Did he have enemies? Was he involved in any conflicts, business disputes, or personal relationships that might have led to violence? Why did he travel to Tennessee in the summer of 1978? Was he lured there? Was he forced there? Or did he go voluntarily, unaware that he was walking into his death? The autopsy findings provided some clues about the crime itself. The fact that Jessie was shot twice in the face suggested this was personal. Executions to the face often indicate anger, hatred, or a desire to dehumanize the victim. The fact that he was then wrapped in a blanket and burned suggested an attempt to conceal his identity and destroy forensic evidence. The fact that he was dumped at a public recreation area rather than hidden in a remote location suggested the killer may have been working quickly, possibly worried about being discovered. Was this a crime of passion that erupted into murder, or was it a calculated assassination? The shell casings recovered from the scene in 1978 were preserved as evidence. Detective Brinkley ordered new ballistic analysis to see if modern technology could provide any additional information. Were the bullets fired from a common type of weapon? Could ballistic databases find any matches to other crimes? The blanket that had been wrapped around Jessie's body was also re-examined. Fiber analysis could potentially determine where the blanket was manufactured, when it was produced, and where it might have been purchased. In 1978, this type of analysis was limited. In 2025, with decades of advances in materials science and forensic examination, there was hope that new information might emerge. Detective Brinkley also reached out to law enforcement agencies in Cullman County, Alabama, asking them to search their archives for any records related to Jessie Lee Williamson. Were there any incident reports from 1978 involving him? Any missing persons reports filed by family members? Any property disputes, civil complaints, or other legal issues that might provide context for why he was murdered? The investigation is ongoing. As of October 2025, no arrests have been made. No suspects have been publicly named. The person who murdered Jessie Lee Williamson has not been identified, but Detective Brinkley is not giving up. Identifying Jessie was half the battle, he said in an interview following the press conference. Now we can investigate his murder properly. We know who he was. We can trace his movements. We can talk to people who knew him. We can build a timeline of his final days. And somewhere in that information is the answer to who killed him and why. The identification of Jessie Lee Williamson represents a bittersweet victory for both law enforcement and the small number of family members who have been located. After 47 years, Jessie is no longer a nameless John Doe. He has been reclaimed from anonymity, given back his identity, acknowledged as a person who lived and died rather than just a set of remains. But justice has not been served. Somewhere, the person who pulled the trigger in 1978 is still free. If they are still alive, they would be in their 70s or 80s now, elderly, perhaps living quiet lives, perhaps believing they escaped consequences for their actions nearly 5 decades ago. Or they may be dead, having taken the secret of Jessie Lee Williamson's murder to their own grave. This is the frustrating reality of cold cases that take decades to solve. DNA can identify victims. Genealogy can build family trees. Science can extract information from degraded evidence. But none of these tools can bring back the dead or undo the decades that have passed since the crime occurred. Detective Brinkley has assembled a task force to reinvestigate the murder. The team includes investigators from the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and law enforcement agencies in Alabama. They are working with forensic experts from Othram Labs, genealogists who helped identify Jessie, and cold case specialists who have experience solving decades-old homicides. The investigation is focusing on several key questions. Why was Jessie Lee Williamson in Tennessee in 1978? Did he have connections to the LaVergne area? Was he visiting someone? Was he passing through on his way to another destination? Or was he brought there against his will? Who knew Jessie would be at Poole Knobs Recreation Area? The murder appears to have been planned. The killer brought a weapon, had a blanket to wrap the body, and chose a location where they could attempt to burn the evidence. This suggests premeditation. It suggests the killer knew where Jessie would be. What was the motive? Was this a robbery gone wrong? A personal dispute? A business conflict? A crime of passion? Without understanding why Jessie was killed, it's difficult to identify. And potential suspects. Did anyone witness the crime or see suspicious activity? The recreation area, while not heavily trafficked at night, was accessible to the public. Someone may have seen a vehicle, heard gunshots, or noticed unusual activity without realizing its significance at the time. Is there DNA evidence from the killer? The blanket, the shell casings, and other evidence from the scene may contain trace DNA that could be analyzed using modern techniques. If the killer touched the blanket, left behind a cigarette butt, or made any physical contact with the evidence, there may be genetic material that could be tested. Detective Brinkley has made it clear that he believes the case is solvable. "We have more information now than we've ever had," he stated. "We know who the victim is. We can research his life. We can identify people who knew him. We can look for connections between Alabama and Tennessee. This case took 47 years to get this far, but that doesn't mean it will take another 47 years to identify the killer." The Rutherford County Sheriff's Office is offering a reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction in Jessie Lee Williamson's murder. The amount has not been publicly disclosed, but Detective Brinkley emphasizes that any information, no matter how insignificant it might seem, could be the key to solving the case. Maybe you remember your father or grandfather mentioning a trip to Tennessee in 1978, Brinkley said. Maybe you remember family members arguing about someone named Jessie. Maybe you found a weapon hidden in a relative's belongings and never understood why it was there. Maybe you overheard a conversation decades ago that didn't make sense at the time, but makes sense now. Please come forward. It's never too late to do the right thing. The case has also drawn attention to the broader issue of unidentified remains and missing persons. There are currently over 15,000 unidentified human remains in the United States, according to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NamUs. Each of these remains represents a person who lived, who had a family, who mattered to someone. And in many cases, forensic genetic genealogy could help identify them if funding, resources, and prioritization align. Jessie Lee Williamson's case was partially funded through crowdfunding on DNA Solves, a platform that allows private citizens to contribute toward the cost of advanced DNA testing in cold cases. The remainder of the costs were covered by nameless, which is funded by the National Institute of Justice. This collaborative funding model demonstrates how solving cold cases often requires partnerships between government agencies, private companies, and concerned citizens. The identification of Jessie Lee Williamson has also reignited interest in other unsolved homicides from the 1970s in Tennessee and surrounding states. Are there connections between Jessie's murder and other cases? Was his killer a serial offender who committed other crimes? Could forensic genetic genealogy solve those cases as well? These questions remain open, waiting for answers that may come tomorrow, next year, or decades from now. Before we conclude, I want you to think about something. If you're watching this video in 2025, the person who killed Jessie Lee Williamson could still be alive. They could be someone's grandfather, someone's elderly neighbor, someone living a quiet retirement, believing they got away with murder. Drop a comment. Do you think deathbed confessions happen in cases like this? Do you think someone out there knows something and has been carrying that secret for 47 years? In the months following the identification of Jessie Lee Williamson, his story has resonated with people across the country who follow cold cases and advocate for victims of unsolved crimes. His case has been featured in true crime documentaries, discussed on podcasts, and analyzed by amateur sleuths who comb through public records looking for clues. But for the family members who provided DNA to confirm his identity, the identification brings complex emotions. Relief that Jessie is no longer nameless. Grief for a relative they never knew or barely remember. Frustration that the person responsible for his murder has not been brought to justice. And questions, so many questions, about what happened in the summer of 1998. Detective Brinkley has been in regular contact with the family, providing updates on the investigation while respecting their privacy. He describes them as supportive, but understandably overwhelmed by the situation. This family had no idea that one of their relatives had been murdered and left unidentified for nearly 5 decades, he explained. It's a lot to process, but they want answers. They want to know what happened to Jessie and why. The broader impact of this case extends beyond just one murder investigation. Jessie Lee Williamson's identification demonstrates the power of forensic genetic genealogy to solve seemingly impossible cases. It shows that advances in technology can breathe new life into decades-old investigations. And it provides hope to thousands of families who have missing loved ones or unidentified remains. Organizations like DNA Doe Project, Othram Labs, and Parabon Nano Labs are working on hundreds of similar cases across the United States, using genetic genealogy to identify unknown victims and criminals. Each successful identification, like Jessie's, provides momentum for the field and demonstrates the value of investing in these technologies. But it also highlights the limitations. Identification is only the first step. Bringing killers to justice requires traditional detective work, interviewing witnesses, analyzing evidence, building cases that can withstand legal scrutiny. And after 47 years, that work becomes exponentially more difficult. Witnesses die. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Killers themselves may be dead. Detective Brinkley acknowledges these challenges, but remains committed to seeking justice for Jessie Lee Williamson. "Every cold case has obstacles," he said. "But every cold case also has the potential to be solved. We don't give up on victims because time has passed. We don't give up on families because the investigation is difficult. We keep working. We keep investigating. And we hope that somewhere, someone has information that will break this case open." As of this writing in October 2025, the investigation continues. Tips are still coming in. Leads are being followed. Evidence is being reanalyzed with modern technology. And somewhere in the accumulated data of 47 years of investigation, there may be the key to identifying who killed Jessie Lee Williamson and why. If you're watching this video and you have any information about Jessie Lee Williamson's murder, please contact the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office Detective Bureau at 615-904-3045. You can also submit anonymous tips through Crime Stoppers or other tip lines. Your information, no matter how insignificant it may seem, could be the piece of the puzzle that finally brings justice to a man who waited 42 years just to have his name back. Jessie Lee Williamson is no longer a nameless victim. After 47 years as Rutherford County John Doe, after decades of being reduced to case numbers and forensic descriptions, after lying in an unmarked grave with no one to mourn him, he has been reclaimed. He has his identity back. He is Jessie Lee Williamson, born in 1926 in Alabama, lived through the Great Depression and World War II, underwent heart surgery in an era when such procedures were dangerous, and died violently in Tennessee in 1978 at the age of 50. But his story is not complete. The final chapter, the chapter that names his killer, that explains why he was murdered, that brings closure to his family and justice to his memory, has not yet been written. This is the reality of many cold cases. Technology can solve mysteries that seemed impossible. DNA can identify victims and criminals. Genealogy can connect distant relatives across decades and continents. But none of these tools can substitute for the human element, for witnesses who remember, for records that still exist, for people who know something and choose to come forward. Somewhere, someone knows what happened to Jessie Lee Williamson in the summer of 1978. Someone knows why he traveled to Tennessee. Someone knows who shot him 4 times. Someone knows why his body was wrapped in a blanket and burned at a recreation area boat ramp. And that someone has the power to finally close this case, to give Jessie Lee Williamson not just his name, but justice. Detective Sergeant Richard Brinkley spent years working to identify this victim. He refused to let Jessie remain nameless. He pursued every lead, tried every new technology, and never gave up on a man he had never met. Now he's asking for help from anyone who can provide it. If you made it to the end of this investigation with me, thank you for caring about Jessie Lee Williamson's story. Hit that subscribe button for more cold case investigations. Like this video, if you believe every victim deserves both their name and justice. Share this video with anyone who might have information about unsolved cases from the 1970s in Tennessee or Alabama. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from today? Do you remember hearing about an unidentified body found in Tennessee in 1978? Do you have family connections to Cullman County, Alabama? Do you have any information, no matter how small, that might help solve this case? Jessie Lee Williamson's case reminds us that no case is ever truly cold. Advances in science can revive investigations decades later. Dedicated investigators can refuse to give up. And sometimes, after nearly half a century, a nameless victim can finally be identified. But identification is not justice. It's just the beginning. The person who killed Jessie Lee Williamson is still out there. And the investigation to find them continues. We will not rest until this case is fully solved. We will not forget Jessie Lee Williamson. And we will never stop fighting for justice, no matter how many years it takes.